Dan Alexander. I'm here at Sloat on Miller Avenue in Mill Valley. We'll talk about everything we can about tomatoes in about 45 minutes here right now, and then have time for questions. And we're going to start with a little bit of botany, but just a little bit. Tomatoes are members of the potato family, the Solanaceae, along with peppers and eggplant. Tomatoes and peppers are New World plants. Europeans didn't know about them until the Spanish explorers came to the New World. They started in probably South America and were developed as food in Mexico, and then taken around the world by Spanish and Portuguese sailors. And now there are tomatoes that are, you might say, indigenous to just about every part of the temperate and tropical world. We have a particular climate here in the Bay Area, although it's pretty diverse if we take the entire Bay Area. But the one thing that we have in common in all of the area is we have relatively cold nights. This is different than most of the world during the summer. The Mediterranean climate only exists in a few places and allows us to cool off at night, which is nice without air conditioning. But it makes it a little more difficult for us to grow some of these plants that originally developed where the nights are warmer. A tomato fruit is, in fact, botanically the fruit of the tomato plant. It's the ovary that covers the seeds and is designed to attract animals to eat it and poop it out. And the seeds then have a place to grow and some fertilizer to fertilize them at the outset. We think of tomatoes as being an annual plant because today here in the Bay Area, it grows during the summer season. It gives us the fruit, and then the plant dies either because it gets infested with funguses or we just give up on it because the weather's getting cool and it's not ripening fruit anymore, or it freezes. But in fact, it's a perennial plant that in the right circumstances would be back year after year. And that's true of peppers as well. But there's really no way to keep a tomato plant alive during the winters short of a greenhouse. And even then, they're subject to so many diseases that the odds are that you'd be better off starting each year with a new plant. Because they're in the potato family and because they're really closely related to potatoes, they share a lot of diseases with potatoes, including late blight, which is the potato famine blight that wiped out a lot of Ireland. And as a result, we have to be somewhat aware of disease factors with the tomatoes we grow so that we don't spread bad things to our neighbors and vice versa. So we'll talk about that sort of thing in a little bit more detail later on. Tomatoes ideally like full sun. They like days that aren't more than about 85 degrees in temperature, and they like nights that are 60 degrees or so. You tell me when we last had a night that was 60 degrees. You can probably remember it. And I think there were two the last year, the whole year. Most of our nights get down into the low 50s, even in the middle of the summer. And that's a little cool for tomatoes. And the effect on the tomato is that it has to make sugars to ripen the fruit. And when the temperatures get below about 55, they stop making those sugars and they stop ripening the fruit. And so here, tomatoes go through this almost daily routine of ripening and then stopping, and then waiting for the temperature to get warm again during the day, and ripening for a while, and then stopping, and then ripening and stopping. And so we'll talk more about what effect that has on your fruit selection, your variety selection, and why we're a little bit limited in the tomato varieties that we have success with here. I won't go into the US Supreme Court case that talks about whether it's a fruit or a vegetable, but if you want to look it up, it's a lot of fun. It's called Nix versus Hedden. It's from 1893, and it's a short case, very readable and very logical. It decides, by the way, that it's a vegetable for tax purposes. There are some concepts with tomatoes that are important for you as a tomato plant buyer or grower from seed, for that matter. The first is days to harvest. The tag on the tomato plant or the sign at the nursery or garden center where you get it is probably going to tell you days to, of course, I picked one here that doesn't say that. It should tell you days to ripen. Let's find one that actually says that. On the back of this, in very small print, which I can barely read, it says 80 days, and the variety is Julia Child. What does 80 days mean? It means that in ideal circumstances, which means you live in Alabama, the tomato plant from about this size, planted in the ground, will take 80 days for the first ripe fruit. That's almost 3 months. And Julia Child is a fairly large tomato, and it's not surprising that it takes 80 days. The shortest time to harvest that you're going to find is about 55 days, 60 days, somewhere in there. That's still almost 2 months before you get a ripe fruit. And again, that's in ideal circumstances. So the early girl or the sun gold that take about 60 days are probably going to take more than 60 days here because of this night differential that we have with the cool temperature. So a 60-day tomato is probably really a 70-day tomato. An 80-day tomato is at least 90, and a 90-day tomato is very, very difficult to ripen here. Now, there's another effect on the tomato that you have when it takes a long time to ripen, and that's that the skin gets thicker and thicker and thicker the longer the tomato is on the vine. And so your wonderful, big, Better Boy tomato that you might see a picture of is not going to be so easy to slice without a very sharp Ginsu knife or something, because the skin is going to thicken up over time. Our hottest areas here, I noticed that Pleasanton is going to be up into the 90s next week, Thursday. Obviously get a little hot for the tomatoes. And early in the season like this, that kind of hot weather can be very hard on these seedlings. Most of these growers are in cooler areas than we are, certainly in the East Bay and the 680 corridor. Most of these are grown in the Santa Cruz area, the Sebastopol area, St. Helena area, mostly under shade cloth. And if you buy one tomorrow and stick it out in full sun and it gets to 90 degrees on Thursday next week, you're probably going to have a tomato that has collapsed and maybe died. So watch for early hot weather and give them some shade if they need it. Put a box over them if you have to, or tilt something up so that it gives them some shade in the hot part of the day if we have early heat wave like that. It can be very, very hard on them. Now, another concept that's important is whether the tomato is indeterminate or determinate. Like indeterminate means we can't tell how big it's going to get. The Guinness Book of World Records says that a sun gold tomato got ginormous. There's a picture of it going over like a grape arbor, and it must be 18 or 20 feet long at least. On the other hand, a bush early girl tomato or a bush champion is only going to get about, from the table here, about 2 feet tall. It's called a determinate tomato, and each branch is going to end with a set of flowers and a set of tomatoes, and then it's going to sort of stop producing in big quantity. Bush tomatoes were developed by growers so that they could harvest all the fruit at the same time. And so, for instance, if you are going to make a lot of canning tomatoes, you want them all to come at once. You want to pick them all, you take them to the processing plant, and you process them all together. There are advantages to determinate tomatoes like that. They're easier to grow in containers, for instance, because they don't get gigantic. But you just have to remember that their season may be a little shorter. It's not that they don't keep producing, but they don't keep producing in such quantity. So indeterminate, giant, determinate, smaller. There are also tomatoes you'll see that are called dwarfs. There's one called Little Napoli that is just a very tiny little plant, good for even a fairly small container. Not going to give you a huge amount of tomatoes, but it's a nice little plant. Then we have the term heirloom, which is associated with open pollinated. And we also have to talk about hybrid or non-hybrid. Heirloom tomatoes are open pollinated tomatoes, which are at least 40 or 50 years old. There's no crystal clear definition of what an heirloom is. The concept is that these are plants that have been grown from seed over and over again in an open pollinated way, which means they're just allowed to pollinate themselves naturally, and that they are not hybrids that have specifically been crossed from one variety to another to make a certain characteristic. So any hybrid tomato, by definition, is not an heirloom tomato. Any open pollinated tomato can be an heirloom tomato if it's been around for a while, basically. So the obvious candidates to think about when you're talking heirlooms would be things like Cherokee Purple, Black Crim, Brandywine, that are the perennial taste test winners. When you have a big tomato taste test, everybody seems to agree those are the quintessential tomatoes. Now, unfortunately, they're all fairly large, late tomatoes, which makes them a little bit of a challenge for us to grow. Of those three, Black Crim is probably the easiest to grow in our climate. And in the warmer regions, I would certainly try Cherokee Purple and Brandywine if you want a real tomato flavor of the old-fashioned kind. They're wonderful tomatoes. But don't limit yourself to a variety or a couple of varieties. If you have room for several tomatoes, grow different varieties so that you have the possibility of success with one or more of them. Let's just put it that way. I wouldn't count on any particular variety, any particular year, because there's so many different things that can happen. Organic or conventional? Organic is a certification. I mean, it's a concept, but in terms of what you are buying, it's a certification. It means that somebody has looked at all of the inputs that the grower is using and determined that, yes, those qualify as organic inputs under the organic laws that we have, so that you can advertise it as organic. At home, more loosely, organic probably means we're using organic organic fertilizers as opposed to chemically derived fertilizers. We're using only minimal pesticides like oils and soaps, and maybe a certifiable bacterial fungicide. And you can tell whether the plants you're buying are organic by the label. Generally will, if we can zoom in here, Jen. There are several different labels, but one of them is the USDA organic, the little green label in the circle there. And then there's the California version of that is looks very similar, but it'll say certified organic in some fashion like that. We slope carry organically grown vegetables. We generally also carry some conventionally grown vegetables. Most notably, strawberries in 6-packs are very difficult to find, for instance, organically grown. But this is a conventionally grown champion tomato from a reputable grower. And personally, I wouldn't be afraid to grow a conventionally grown tomato plant. I would tend to grow it in more or less organic circumstances at my home. And by the time it makes the fruit, I would be reasonably confident that I'm not consuming anything I don't want to consume. I will give a shout out for organic growing in general and buying organically grown plants in general, as organic farmers by definition have to be building their soil in a natural way, and it's better in general for the environment. There will be a more diverse group of insects living with them, and the soil should be healthier than in a giant farm that's using a lot of chemical fertilizers to keep the fertility of the soil. So I'm all for organic, but I wouldn't necessarily limit myself 100%. If I found a variety I want to grow that's not available organically, I would go ahead and do it. For instance, here's the Juliet, which is one of my all-time favorites. And I've been having a little trouble finding Juliets from an organic source, although I think Kelly's is growing it. But I definitely want to grow some Juliets this year. Juliet is a wonderful little plum tomato. It's a hybrid, so it's not by definition an heirloom and can't be, but it is very flavorful and very productive and fairly disease resistant. One of the reasons for making hybrid tomatoes is to find tomatoes that are resistant to diseases. And in my mind, that's a good thing. Unfortunately, in developing a lot of the hybrids, the hybridizers didn't realize what genes made tomato flavor. And so they accidentally got rid of some of the good flavor in a lot of the tomatoes. More recently, scientists have figured out what gene that is, and they're putting them back in the tomatoes. That all sounds a little bit Frankenstein-y maybe, but it's the same process that's been used for eons, simply selecting the tomatoes that have the right characteristics that you're looking for and growing them, and then painstakingly taking pollen from one and putting it on another to see if you can make it even better. That's not genetic engineering. There are no mouse genes involved here, but it does have sometimes the consequence of getting rid of characteristics that you don't want to get rid of. And that's just part of science, I guess. And you will see on some tomatoes designations like V or F. That'll be in hybrids, and that means that they are wilt resistant. Wilts are fungus diseases that attack them. and verticillium is the V, fusarium is the F. They are also subject to things, since they're members of the potato family, and so is tobacco. They can get tobacco mosaic virus, so don't smoke around them. It's actually one of the ways that the mosaic virus is passed is as strange as it might seem, and there's no cure for viral diseases in plants, so you don't want to pass it along that way. Now, I want to talk about the concept of suckers, and this is a wonderful example of a tomato plant that is growing some suckers. Suckers are really just branches of tomato plants, but they have gotten the bad name sucker because some people don't like them. The main stem of a tomato plant goes up for a while, and then at every leaf axil, or the leaf comes out, there's a bud that is a potential new branch. And you can see on this one, there's a little branch growing out of the leaf axil, and that's what people call suckers. There's some bit of wives' tale wisdom that you should remove all the suckers below the first flower of a tomato plant. And here's the first flower way up here. And that would require removing all of these side branches, this little guy, and then you end up with a few big leaves and potential tomatoes right here where the flowers are. Personally, I think that's nonsense. When the plant is young, you want as many leaves as you can possibly develop with just normal growth, and this is all very normal growth, so that the plant is making lots of food for itself. After all of the energy that the plant has comes from the sun, and it's only the leaves that are capable of collecting the sunlight and turning it into energy for the plant. Fertilizers, by the way, do not create the energy for the plant. They simply give it chemical elements that it can use in the photosynthesis process so that the leaves can make more food. So leaves are what are important. And these lower leaves are feeding the plant just as much as the upper leaves are. And so leave the suckers on. Now, in fact, here's a really good example of if you had removed this sucker, you would have removed these little flower buds right here, which are going to make lots more tomatoes. Similarly, this sucker already has flower buds on it, as does this one. So instead of having 3 dozen tomatoes forming, we've only got a dozen up here that would be forming if I had removed all the suckers. So suckers are good to a certain extent. If the plant gets too congested, and here's an example of that. For instance, I've got one branch growing here, and I've got another one growing out right on top of it. Well, those two are really in the same sunlight space, so I would remove one of those, probably the newer one, this one. And they're really easy to remove, by the way. You just snap them off. Here it is. The funny thing about it is that if you were to stick this in
That's what I was just going to ask. Yeah.
Tomatoes are covered with little hairs. The stems of the tomatoes are covered with little hairs, and those little hairs are potential roots, essentially. So when we get a seedling like this, this is a nice size to buy at the nursery. It's a 3.5-inch pot. This is a square 3.5. This is a 4-inch pot. They'll all be together, basically. Different growers use different kinds of containers. But they've been grown from seed, and either right in the pot or they've been transplanted when very young into the pot. On this one, we can still see one of the cotyledon leaves. The first leaves that emerge from the seed is right here. I'm going to pick it off. That's a cotyledon seed. And you can see how simple and different it is from the leaves that grow what we call true leaves. Usually then there's a little space before the first true leaf comes out. And in a little seedling like this, we want to cover, when we plant it, some of the stem of the tomato with soil so that it can grow more roots out of the stem. And so I would pick off maybe the bottom 2 true leaves. I'm just using my thumbnail to do that so that I've got a little space there. The research indicates that picking off 2 true leaves is about as much benefit as you get. So there's no real point in burying it up to here. You get about as much new root growth as you're going to get out of those first 2 nodes and the root hairs that are around them. So then I would plant it deep so the soil is here, and then you have lots of nice new roots. Now I want to immediately segue from there into, don't do that with a grafted tomato. Grafted tomatoes are becoming more popular, and rightly so. The difference is that a rootstock tomato is grown from seed or from a cutting, and then the variety that you want to grow, like black crim or brandywine or even a cherry tomato, are grafted onto that rootstock. So the tomato will show a graft scar, and it'll look something like that. It looks like a little scar, and that wants to be up in the air. So you never want to bury deeply a grafted tomato. The problem is that then you'll get roots growing out of the part that was the top of the tomato grafted on, and you don't want those roots. You want the roots of the rootstock, which is more hot and cold tolerant, more disease tolerant, and more vigorous than the roots of the tomato variety. So that's an important distinction. And I recommend that you try grafted tomatoes for the big tomatoes that are difficult to grow, primarily. They'll also give you some advantages with the cherry tomatoes, believe it or not, but you're going to see the biggest difference in the larger tomatoes that take a long time to ripen. And you pay accordingly. It's about $15 for this grafted tomato as opposed to $4 for these little guys. But for a big tomato, it might be worth it, especially if you've had difficulty getting them to ripen. And they're becoming more and more popular, and I'm getting good feedback on them from people. There are also now peppers, eggplant, cucumbers available in grafted form and more vigorous than their seedling cousins. Now, the different sizes, when you buy a tomato plant at the nursery, you want it to look green and fresh. It shouldn't have purple leaves. That's an indication they've been in the pot for too long. And it shouldn't look sad. I wish I had brought a sad looking one in here with me. I forgot to do that. But the roots should have filled out the pot nicely like that. And if you're going to plant it directly in the ground, you're going to want to, let's see, I need a trash can here. There we go. I just use the little tag usually myself to scratch up the root ball so that the roots aren't going to keep going around kind of like they were at the edge of the can or the container. This also makes more surface area. You can see how much more surface area there is now than there was when it was smooth. So that the new soil that's going to join with this has lots more nooks and crannies to get into, so that you've got a good interlocking of the new soil and the old soil. Again, here are cotyledon leaves that I'm taking off. I'm going to take off the first couple true leaves. And then I would plant it deep in the pot or in the ground, so that the soil level was about at the third true leaf. I prefer that the leaves not touch the ground, so I might even remove this one, which is hanging down, and then this sucker can continue to grow up, and I won't have leaves touching the ground. The reason for that is that it's more likely to pick up fungal or bacterial diseases from the soil if it's actually touching the soil. Although that's certainly far from automatic and not something you should be overly concerned about. When the plants get bigger, if they're growing in the ground, they are going to touch the ground unless you are fanatical about getting out there and keeping that from happening. Now the roots of a grafted tomato. Let's see, that's quite a root system in a little container. I'm sure this isn't any older than that tomato, but well, maybe a little bit. But a really nice root system. And I would do the same thing here. And even if it was too tough to scratch open with the tag, I would just use my handy dandy pruning shears and, you know, give it a little workout, and even clip it around the bottom. Doesn't hurt a bit. It's good for the roots to get the message that they have to grow out, that it isn't all just status quo. And so you rough them up thoroughly all the way around and on the bottom. And then again, since this is a grafted tomato, I want the surface of the soil that came in the pot to be right at the top of my surface in the ground or in the pot that I'm going to put it in. That's pretty much fun. This is a Visitation Valley, which is a semi-determinate tomato of about medium size, very good flavor. And I don't know if it was actually developed by somebody in San Francisco, but it has a nice local name.
Dan, with that one, would you pick off the, like, because this has like some yellowing on the leaves?
I would. If I see some spots like that, I don't know what that is, whether that is just physical damage, whether it's some water got on it at the wrong time. But I would just pick off at this stage leaves that have spots on them, and keep an eye on it. But the new growth doesn't have any of that, so I'm fairly confident that that's nothing to worry about. There are leaf spot diseases that are fairly distinctive, and if you get a lot of leaf spots on your tomatoes, the first thing I would do is take some samples to your local garden center and see if they know what it is. They're almost always fungal, although they could be bacterial. And generally speaking, tomato plants will grow faster than the fungus can spread. And anyway, that's your goal. Your typical indeterminate tomato plant at home should get at least 4 to 5 feet tall, and should be very bushy. And if that's not happening, then you need probably more nutrition. You may need more sun, but that's your goal. And indeterminate tomatoes need support. We happen to have some examples of support over here. These are what are called tomato cages. There are several different styles and colors and that sort of thing, but the basic tomato cage, if I can get them apart.
It's always a thing with.
It's always the thing with tomato. The basic tomato cage, this little galvanized guy, it goes this way, not this way. And the idea is that these little prongs go into the soil, either in the ground or in a pot. So for instance, they go like this, and then the tomato would grow up through it and be supported by the different rungs of the cage. Depending, I had somebody come in yesterday who was having the problem in their raised beds that the tomato would get to a certain height and weight, and then the whole thing would fall over because the tomato cage, the soil was soft enough that the cage wasn't really holding on to the soil. So I recommended they just take some wooden stakes and pound them down through the raised bed into the ground below, and then attach the cage to it so it can't fall over. But there are solutions for most problems. These wire cages will last you numerous years. If you're close to the coast, they may rust faster than the painted ones. These green ones are kind of the Rolls Royce of tomato cages. They're quite a bit more expensive, but they're also quite a bit thicker and heavier duty and will probably last more years. They're a little shorter, which is a bit of a knock on them, but you can also use stakes. I always have a bundle of 4-foot bamboo stakes handy, and I just use them everywhere. And with tomato plants, I usually end up with a very strange looking array of stakes going in all directions, depending on where our branches come out of the tomato, and works fine for me. So just find a system that you like and give them some support so that if they're laying on the tomatoes will grow fine on the ground, by the way. You don't have to support them, but you're going to have more problems with snails and slugs and earwigs eating them on the ground than if you can hold them up off the ground. I mean, that's really what it's about. Also, they'll take up less room in your garden if you support them. Let the zucchini squash run around on the ground around them. Okay, now what they really require in your garden are sunlight. A full day sunlight, by definition, is about 6 hours between about 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. That's when the sun is really doing its work with a plant. If you have less than that, you're going to get less production. You'll probably still get some fruit. If you have less than about 4 hours, I would suggest growing something other than tomatoes. You have a good spot for leafy greens, but not for making things that require a lot of sugars to develop. They also are pretty hungry plants in the sense of needing soil nutrition, fertility. Fertilizer, the macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash or potassium. And those usually need to be added to the soil either through manures or through fertilizers that have a balance of those elements in them. One that we carry that's probably the most popular is the EB Stone tomato vegetable food. The numbers on it are 4, 5, 3. That's nitrogen, phosphorus, potash, percentage. You'll notice on organic fertilizers that the percentages are never real high. Except that if you're using pure blood meal or something like that, you'll get somewhere in the 10% nitrogen. But generally, you're going to see numbers around 5s and 6s and 4s for an organic fertilizer. In a chemical fertilizer, you can get numbers that are much higher. This is the Max C all-purpose is 16, 16, 16. This is designed to be mixed with water and then watered into the plants. And it's a nice fertilizer, but it's not organic. It's a chemical fertilizer with seaweed in it for micronutrients. I use it as supplemental feeding, but I mainly rely on the organic fertilizers and on compost and manure. Compost, the way I use the term, is basically decomposed vegetation or food, and is the sort of thing that is made out of your green can waste. We have a nice compost here, the organic compost. And then manures like chicken manure, dairy manure, steer manure, are relatively high in nitrogen and give you the nitrogen component, as well as high in organic matter. They break down into humus and increase the friability, the texture of your soil. So some people don't like to use manure, and that's fine. There's no need for it, but you probably will need some supplemental fertilizer then if you're not using any manure. If you are using manure, you may not need as much of the supplemental fertilizer.
Hey Dan, I'm gonna kind of start butting in now, if that's okay.
Okay.
You're touching on a lot of points. We have a lot of really good questions, and I've been answering a few. So thanks everyone for bringing those in. And while you're talking about soils and fertilizers, that's a really big one that people are asking about. So one thing I think would be good is if you go through the differences between making your soil for a ground plot and then making your soil for a container plot, and maybe some differences there.
Sure. In the ground, most of the time, you're not going to have enough organic matter in the soil to be ideal when you start out the garden plot. And so you want to add compost and manure or some form of organic matter. And you don't make perfect soil in just one season, but you can really improve your soil for the first season and then continue to add organic matter in subsequent plantings so that you get a nice balance of mineral soil and organic matter. Ideally, it's about 10% organic matter, about 90% or mineral soil that you started with. Soils are highly variable from sandy to clayey and everything in between. But the good news is that adding organic matter improves clay soil, makes them drain better, makes the minerals in them more available to the plants, and they also improve sandy soils. Organic matter will improve sandy soils, make it so that it holds more moisture and holds more nutrition. So that's just a given that you add. I like to add about 3 parts compost to 1 part manure and put on about a 2-inch layer over your garden plot and then dig it in. And then each time you plant a new crop, add more of the compost and manure because it decomposes relatively quickly. If you're using a barkier product, something that's packaged as planting mix or a finely ground mulch, that won't decompose as fast, but it also won't give you the nutritional value that the compost and manure will. You also should use a little bit of the balanced fertilizer at the time of planting. In a container, I highly recommend a good quality potting soil for the container. You are not going to be able to make a better potting soil at home than these guys can make, who have been doing it for years and have a good finished product. In a container, the danger of just throwing in some dirt and mixing in a little bit of something else with it is that it's going to pack down and become a soil that lacks oxygen and that even the water can't penetrate evenly. And I have made lots of mud pie soil mixes in my time and have come to believe it's not worth my time to try to do what has already been done and is very successful. So you start with a good quality potting soil, fill the container completely with that, and add some fertilizer, and then fertilize as you go along, especially if you're using a potting soil, it's not going to hold on to as much nutrition as a mineral soil can. So fertilize about monthly in your containers or in your beds. If you're using an organic fertilizer, if you're using a more soluble fertilizer, probably every 2 weeks you should fertilize. Let me just mention calcium because I didn't do that. Calcium is critical for avoiding what we call blossom end rot. Blossom end rot happens when the end of the tomato down here, not the stem end, but the end where the blossom was, gets kind of a gray, tan, scabby look to it. And that's usually for lack of calcium. So any good fertilizer should have at least 3% calcium. They have an analysis on them just like your food does at the supermarket. So check it, make sure it's got at least 3% calcium. If what you have at home doesn't, get some oyster shell or something like that that'll give you calcium. And if you have the problem during the year, don't worry, all is not lost. There are liquid calcium. This is Folical from Monterey, which can be sprayed on the foliage and absorbed, and the next crop of tomatoes will be just fine. So keep that in mind. I wouldn't get it unless you have a problem, but just keep liquid calcium in mind in case you do have the problem.
Definitely. That was totally my next question. I think we had a couple of people asking about blossom end rot, and I was letting them know about calcium. Another product that we have is like the CalMag. There's a couple of them in our stores that are good amendments to add some calcium to your soil for that problem. And even the tomato and veg food has a fair bit of calcium in it too, which is a good reason why you want to use it a little bit earlier on. Good. And then I also have some questions about planting other plants together near tomatoes. So is there other vegetables you can plant close by? Is there a problem with planting too close, too farther away? And other stuff around the companion planting?
Well, plants can be planted around the tomato plants. Tomatoes are pretty voracious and are going to suck both the moisture and the nutrition out of the soil. So generally you're going to want to plant lighter, shall we say, lighter weight plants around them. Leafy greens, lettuces, arugula, even I mean, you can even get serious about it and grow, beans up your up your tomato vines if you want to, although I've never done that. But the things to avoid are root crops are not so good to grow with tomatoes, carrots and radishes. You can grow onions, especially if you're cutting for scallions, chives, almost any of the herbs, the aromatic herbs, think oregano, marjoram, basil for sure.
Basil for sure.
And then you can plant a little Parmesan plant with it and have your caprese
Oh.
salad.
Delicious.
No, that doesn't
No,
work.
people are gonna ask for that now.
Yeah, people will be asking for that now, won't they? Yeah, so I wouldn't be too worried, except that know there's going to be quite a bit of competition from the tomato plant, and that you don't want to grow other deep-rooted, demanding plants right next to the tomato plant. But I also, you don't want to plant potatoes near the tomatoes because of disease interaction. And it's even better to keep the peppers a little bit away from the tomatoes. I wouldn't put them, for instance, in the same container or in the same row of your garden. And if you have the luxury of enough space, it's best, of course, to rotate crops from one year to another so that they're not growing in just the same place year after year.
Nice. Definitely. We had definitely some people asking about, the other kinds of vegetables. You covered most of them. And I was letting them know that it is really just about the space that the tomato roots take up, because they are such a fast growing plant that they will just kind of outcompete most things that get close to them. So be careful of that. Maybe go for shallow rooted things. Have another couple questions. I think you probably went over a lot of this in your seed class, which was earlier this year. But growing tomatoes from seed versus planting them from the plant. And actually a question for me too, is it too late to start from seed right now? Should you still grow it indoors? Can you do it outdoors? Kind of those questions.
It's not too late to start seeds, although I would avoid at this date starting seeds of the late tomatoes, the big ones that take a long time to mature. But early tomatoes, you can certainly start from seed. You should start them indoors. You should grow them to at least a couple of true leaves indoors if you have a bright enough spot to do it. And then transplant them, get them used to being outside before planting them out. It takes about a week for them to sprout, and it takes less than a month to get to this point. And our season really goes through October here. So you have plenty of time. It's fun to grow them from seed, and you can sometimes find some varieties that aren't readily available. The thing you have to look out for is that there are a zillion varieties of tomatoes available. And if you go on the internet or up to the seed place in Santa Rosa, Petaluma, you'll find a jillion different ones, but most of the time, tomatoes are best in a particular location. And the one advantage to buying seedlings is that most of the reputable nurseries, at least, have over the years figured out what works in their area. And so I would be a little bit trusting in that sense to talk to your local garden center and find out what people have had success with over the years and kind of concentrate on those. And then, if you want to grow something exotic and try that out, fine. But just because it works in Georgia doesn't mean it's going to work here or Nebraska. We want to look for tomatoes that have some kind of Siberian or Eastern European or local heritage, because it turns out that tomatoes that grow in a relatively short season, like Eastern Europe, do relatively well with our climate. And I don't know exactly why that is, but it seems to be true. And then we have more locally developed plants or plants that we have local experience with that we know we can adequately grow here. And there's no reason not to take advantage of that knowledge that already exists. So I recommend, talking with people and finding out what's going on. If you have neighbors that grow tomatoes every year, find out what they grow.
Definitely, yeah. Look at what's growing in your area and what your garden center has, because if you live nearby your garden center, or at least closer to that one, then most likely the tomatoes that they are bringing in are the ones that you actually can grow. And it's always good to talk to someone there, because there are some varieties or some heirlooms that, like in San Francisco is where I am, we have heirlooms, we have the beefsteak, some of those harder ones that do better in a little bit warmer areas, and we always recommend it against it if you're right by the coast. But we also have bunches of cherry tomatoes. We have Sweet 100, Sweet Millions, Black Prem, Sun Golds. All those cherry tomatoes do really well here. So I always recommend those to those close to the ocean in more our specific area. So it's good to just ask around, see what people are growing, see what they had success with. And yeah, pick out those kinds of tomatoes. I think we're hitting a lot of the questions. We had a bunch more kind of coming right at the very end, but there's some good ones. I also wanted to ask if a lot of people are just wanting to know, maybe go over one more time, the pot size or container sizes or soil space for tomatoes. How deep should they go? 10-gallon big enough? 20-gallon too big? 15-gallon big? Like all those kinds of questions are coming in.
Sure. Good questions. My rule of thumb is if you want an indeterminate tomato to grow all season in a container, you need about 2 cubic feet of container size, which is about a 15-gallon can. It's one big bag of potting soil. And I've actually grown that right in the bag of potting soil. I cut the top off, punched some holes for drainage, planted the plant in the bag of potting soil, and it did fine all season. So right down here is the big black container is a 15-gallon container. And that's a 2 cubic foot bag of potting soil, which will just about fill it up perfectly. So that is your basic size for an indeterminate tomato. A determinate tomato can be in something a little smaller. 10-gallon size would be fine. 5-gallon is pushing your luck a little bit. What happens in a smaller container than the plant needs is it grows fine for part of the season and then it just poops out. It's filled up the container, the roots are overcrowded, and it's just not picking up the water and nutrition that it needs. It doesn't mean you won't get great tomatoes for half the season, but then that might be the end of it. Well, that's not so bad, is it? I do recommend a 1-gallon size container as the first step for the seedling. Even if you're eventually going to put them in the ground, put them in a gallon can for a few weeks until the roots have pretty well filled out the gallon can. You may or may not remember this plant. I planted this at the, what was it? Oh, the spring, preparing your spring vegetable garden. So this was a little guy about, I don't know, 3 weeks ago. And you can see he's starting to fill up. And
Nice.
very beautifully, little roots there. And he's ready to put in the ground or in a bigger container. But he's very happy, he or she or it. They are very happy and growing very well. And that's partly because in a small container like this, the roots can warm up each day. In the ground, you could put a thermometer in it, it's probably well below 50 degrees. And they're going to just sit there while the ground is really cold. So you'll get a real head start if you plop them into a gallon can, grow them for a few weeks till the roots have filled up the gallon can. And don't be afraid to pop them out of the can and look at them like I just did. And then plant them into their permanent location and you'll get a real head start. Not just a little head start, but a big head start.
Yeah, we had some people asking about grower boxes and planting in redwood boxes and cedar boxes and all these different kinds of things. I think they're all great. Generally, if they have enough size, like you're saying, somewhere around that 2 gallon or 2 cubic foot or even bigger, is great for them, and they'll grow fine.
Yeah.
So whatever
only-
container you've got.
Only thing I think you want to avoid is wood that, you know, has preservative in it.
Pressure treated.
Pressure treated, right,
Yeah.
wood, probably not the best for food boxes, yeah. One is, you'll avoid a lot of frustration in future years if you put the label with the
Keep it,
plant,
yeah.
so that if you have success with it, you know what to get next year. If you have either don't like the tomato or it doesn't do well, you know what not to get next year. I have so many people coming in and saying, oh, I had this great tomato, I want another one. And then what are they gonna say? You know, well, it was red, and it was round.
Mhm.
Okay, yeah, we could fix you up there. So I like to use these plastic tags that don't disappear on me. And I usually put them on the bigger tomatoes here at the nursery, so that if they lose their little label, we still know what they are. But it can just help you a lot to develop your tomato growing prowess, to know what you've grown and how it did.
Yeah. One last little quick question is, when you're determining your tomato or analyzing them as they're growing, if they're getting too big in certain directions or too tall or anything, can you snip them back? And just a quick tip on how to snip them.
You can snip them back. Tomatoes will grow out from, as I said, from every node. Every leaf node has a bud in it and is capable of growing. So if this branch, you know, pretend there was a whole bunch of tomato over here and this branch is growing over here and I don't want it there, I would just snip it off to a leaf bud somewhere here, somewhere like that. I'm not going to snip this one because it's too beautiful. Now this one, for instance, you know, this is kind of a hairy mess right now. So if I didn't want this thing coming way over here, I could just snip it off here, and then this would continue to grow, and maybe I could put a stake in and control it a little better. So there's really no big harm you can do short of cutting it off at the base. It'll continue to grow in all kinds of directions from every option that it has. And if I don't want this sucker here, this branch to grow, I can just take it off. And then the one up here is going to grow, or the one down here is going to grow instead. After a while, it's a fool's errand. You just let them grow.
Let them grow, finish their fruiting, finish their whole cycle, you know, let them have their last of the season. It's very true.
They'll always have the last laugh.
Yeah. And lastly, I had someone asking about fabric pots. I use fabric pots whenever I grow my tomatoes. I think they're great. They work really well. They're also easy to transplant out of. So I think it's a good idea if you're growing
The woolly pots.
the woolly, the fabric. Yeah.
Yeah, the fabric pots are wonderful. The plants really seem to like. I recommend them.